whakarongo mai koutou ki Arrow FM, your community access radio station. Te Rangi o Wairarapa. Ko Michael tēnei and e whai ake nei, Isolation Blues. Now this morning, I'll be needing these because a friend of mine and a man very important to Access Radio in New Zealand, Dr. Brian Pauling, will be calling in. Look forward to that. And chatting about, well, who am I to dictate what we will be chatting about? But as I say, Dr. Brian Pauling calling in quite soon. Now, we all watched and listened to the Prime Minister's press briefing yesterday, didn't we? And we know that, excuse me, I'm going to cough. Just a bit of COVID-19, it'll clear up soon. The press briefing about going down to level 2. Now, level 2 will be occurring on Thursday, but it's a bit of a staggered thing. I was amused to hear, about being staggered because now that people can, well, eventually the entry into bars will be staggered, as will the entry out of bars. So Thursday we'll be starting to get regular program makers back into the station. We'll be staggering that too. We don't want a sudden influx, a massive wildebeest charging through the place. We'll be taking our time with that. But I can already see that Brian Pauling is there on the other end of the blower. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Pretty good. Nice to see you. Now, Dr. Brian Pauling, who I've said is very important to Access Radio in New Zealand. He's written the book on Access Radio, and I mean that literally, the handbook of how we go about things. Brian, how is it in your bubble?
Well, it's been, I have to say, quite a pleasant sojourn. I'm at that age where routine starts to appeal, and the lockdown was a great excuse to have routine. And so my partner and I have settled down and got into a rhythm, and we've quite enjoyed it, I have to say. And of course, we're in that age, which is a little more vulnerable than you are, sir. And as a consequence, we've also been reasonably careful.
Yes, it is, as you say, an age of greater vulnerability, but it's one we're a little bit more, if not accustomed to isolation, then we can cope with it somewhat better. We're not driven to go out and go to nightclubs and whatnot.
That's true. I think that our pleasures at this stage of life can be found closer to home, if you like. I mean, there's nothing like a good book or a particularly interesting movie on Netflix. They do make life bearable and enjoyable. And I have to confess, I have read a lot and watched the screen a little more than I normally would. And of course, listen to that greatest medium of all, the senior medium of radio.
Yes. Now, that senior medium of radio, you've had a fair amount to do with helping train people in that area. You were essentially the founder of what is now the New Zealand Broadcasting School back in the day. And then you were there as, director of it till about 2015?
Yes, I founded the school and was the first head of school, and I passed over that to Paul Norris in 2008. And I stayed on as a senior researcher until I retired in 2015.
Right. Brian, just a little advisory. You're breaking up a little bit. I think the reason why is you might be quite a long way from your device's microphone, and so consequently, I'm just guessing here that it's it's struggling a bit. You're
Oh,
intelligible, I have to say that.
oh, I am intelligible, but not quite as intelligible as you would like. Is that what you're saying?
You know, Brian, that small adjustment you just made then made a world of difference.
I'm I'm willing to make adjustments for my friends at any stage.
Fabulous. Now, Brian, you talked about our happiness at our age to be involved in books, but it's not just reading in your case. Back in the day, of course, you wrote the book that was the kind of guidebook for how access radio should be practiced in New Zealand. Of course, times have changed. That model of families huddling round the radio listening all together has changed. Do you think that the landscape of broadcasting has changed so much that access radio has challenges in how to cope with the various platforms and the different listening habits of people out there?
I think that we could talk for a long time about the media and its future. I think one thing is worth pointing out. No medium that has ever been invented has died to date.
Good point.
Theatre is still there, even although cinema has been around for a long time. Radio is still there, even although television has been around for a long time. I suspect that what happens when new mediums come along is that they are slotted in to their niche, if you like. Some mediums that were dominant, like, for example, before cinema, the theatre was the only thing you went out to be entertained, had to change a little. But it was a challenge to theatre, and they adapted to it. Radio, I think, is a classic example. Radio is as popular today as it's ever been. Listenership to radio overall is very high. And I think you can attribute that to the fact that radio has played to its strengths. And those strengths are quite simple, really. It is the cheapest mass medium to operate and to run, so that makes it easier for a lot of communities to develop radio. It is the only medium in existence that you can use while you're doing something else. You try driving a car and watching television. Yeah. And the third thing about radio, which I think people often forget, is it is still theatre of the mind. When you listen to radio, it requires you to engage in a way that other medium don't, because you have to actually complete the picture that radio is drawing for you. Whereas if you watch television or go to the movies, it's all done for you. So Marshall McLuhan's cool medium and hot medium division. And so I think that radio will always have a role as a medium, as a mass medium in society. And of course, in poorer societies, it is still the main way that people communicate with each other.
Yeah, and you talk about it playing to its strengths. When you mentioned the theatre, I sometimes think that the theatre goes the wrong way when it tries to compete with cinema on its own terms by becoming incredibly flash and having visual devices that are supposed to bowl us over. Whereas in fact, it's not a filmic medium. It is all about people being together in this large room and experiencing the magic of the human voice and people moving around about the place physically in front of you. And likewise, radio has those strengths of immediacy that you spoke about earlier.
Yes, I think that every new medium, when it first starts out, doesn't really know what it is going to become. Your television was originally called radio with pictures, And the people who began television were often radio professionals, and they took a while to understand that that television was an entirely different medium, and they needed to adapt to that. And it's the same with cinema. Cinema for a while really was camera pointed at the stage. And it took a while for them to realize that it had advantages that theatre didn't have. But likewise, I don't think any of the mediums trying to be another medium or trying to emulate another medium are successful. I think you're right, that the theatre is best when it is just people on a stage in front of you performing drama.
Yep. Now, Brian, thinking not just of radio, but broadcasting generally, public broadcasting has always been pretty strong in New Zealand. How do you think is it important in a democracy to have strong public broadcasting, and how are we doing here?
Well, I probably would have a slightly different opinion on that. I don't actually think public broadcasting is particularly strong in New Zealand, and for one very good reason. The second arm of public broadcasting, television, has virtually given up its public role, and it has done so for many, many years. And so we rely for our public broadcasting on Radio New Zealand. And as you well know, Radio New Zealand has been starved of funding for many, many years. We have had a succession of governments that are not particularly prone to enjoying national radio. And one of the ways they show their displeasure is to limit the funding. If you look at public broadcasting in the West worldwide, Radio New Zealand is probably the most underfunded public broadcaster per head of population in the world. And given that, it is amazing what that network has actually provided. It is one of the most remarkable public broadcasting agencies, I believe, in the world for what it does, given what it gets. As far as television is concerned, well, we've had 2 or 3 attempts at public television. I mean, you remember Channel 6 and Channel 7? Once again, politics got in the way, and they disappeared too. I actually think public broadcasting in New Zealand is quite vulnerable. As a nation, we don't value it.
Right. No, I think I see your point. Now, as far as access radio goes, just interestingly, I see that Cindy Beavis died recently. She was fundamental in the formation of access radio. In fact, you've been called the godfather of access radio. I guess she'd be the mother. So, and along with Gillian Woodward, who was a kind of joint mother, what do you think their vision for access radio? Why did they feel the need to begin this thing that we call access radio? And how are we living up to their vision for it, do you think?
And don't forget Pamela Fleming, who was, of course, Cindy's offsider for quite a long time. The history of access in New Zealand is shrouded in mystery. Not very many people seem to be willing to own up to its beginnings. But I think that it would be wise for me to acknowledge the role of Beverly Wakeham, who, at the time that Access Radio was started in Wellington in 1981, was in charge of programs at Radio New Zealand. There was, you may recall, there was a period in the 70s when all of a sudden attitudes towards a lot of things changed, and adult education became very much something of the moment. Adult education facilities developed all around the country. UNESCO had 2 very big conferences on the role of adult education, and the whole concept of learning for life, or lifelong learning, began to develop in the Western democracies as an educational goal. And amongst that was the whole idea of access, that access to learning and access to opportunity should be universal and not be something that was based on any other. And so around the world, people experimented with various ways of getting adults involved in learning. And the open microphone, which I think was begun, believe it or not, with the BBC back in the 1970s, where people were just literally invited to come in and have their say. It became part of the idea of community building and community development. And so I think that Radio New Zealand was establishing the continuing education unit in the 1970s, was getting quite involved in religious broadcasting in the 1970s, and also decided, I think, under the aegis of Beverly Wakeham, to experiment with access radio.
Yep. And that was, as you say, under the aegis of Radio New Zealand, and they had their base there, and then it started to catch on, and stations sprang up right across the country. We're still trying to follow the principles of access radio in a changing media environment. Do you think that access radio is a fundamental part of public broadcasting in the country, and how are we going?
Yeah, I'll answer that. But first, I would just comment that you lot in the Wairarapa have a pretty historic record. You were the second access radio station to go to air. And it followed the pattern that happened quite often around the country, that it was a community education group based, I think, at what was called the Wairarapa Community College. Is that right?
It was the Polytech.
That actually got things going. So you can see the adult education relationship with access radio all around New Zealand in various ways. Coming back to your question, the role of access radio has been, if you look at it from the purely legislative point of view, it was developed as part of New Zealand On Air's responsibilities to actually provide for what was called at the time market failure. We were governed for quite a period of time by very market-driven, right-wing liberal ideas in which the market is the driving force of society. It's what provides everything, and we should let the market decide. But there were some people who believed when broadcasting was deregulated, there were certain things broadcasting needed to do for the community that was not based on market ideas. And so New Zealand On Air was actually established to provide, in broadcasting terms, for those things that the market wouldn't do. And one of the things is spelled out quite precisely in Section 36C of the Broadcasting Act, and that is to provide opportunity for minority interests to go to air. And it actually specifies some of those minority interests. Access radio was embedded right at the beginning in the whole concept of what broadcasting in New Zealand should be. I think the other thing that was picked up very early by New Zealand On Air was that if they were to provide for Section 36C broadcasting, the most effective, the most efficient, and the most accessible medium was radio. And so that was why New Zealand On Air put money into the establishment of access radio stations. Now, if you go back to Section 36C and what it stands for, I still cannot see in today's environment a medium that is more suited for delivering those outcomes than access radio. I think that some people believe that there will be a shift to the web and everything will be web-based. The web is a pull technology, not a push technology. And when you go onto the web, you just seek what you want to find. You seek what interests you. One of the beauties about broadcasting and about access radio is it exposes people to things and to ideas that they wouldn't normally actively seek out. And so I think that access broadcasting does two things for society. It gives a voice to the people who do not have access to the mainstream media. And it also gives the population an opportunity to hear those voices. Now, that is an important concomitant activity of access broadcasting. It is the fact that it is out there to be found. And that is a principle that does not operate on the internet and on the web. And so I think for that reason, too, access radio has an important future role to play.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
One thing to... Oh, sorry, Brian, I interrupted you there.
I was just saying, did that make sense?
Oh, it certainly did. And it made me think, I guess what I believe, too, is that there's one function in delivering material for your constituent audience, the people of your views or your culture, and there's a great value in that. But there's also another one in spreading ideas and information amongst the general public. And that idea that has been expressed by our Prime Minister, that they are us, becomes more possible the more people know about the different communities that exist within our wider society.
You've got it. And I believe that is one of the things that Access does very, very well.
Yeah, Brian, I'm very aware that you are sitting there in your bubble, enjoying watching telly and reading books, but you're also in the business of writing what I think is a very important book, which is the history of access radio in this country. So you know a lot about us. How is that going? I know it's going well, because every so often I get a little questionnaire from you asking for more information. But our listeners would be very interested to know about the development of that book.
Well, it is a history of community access radio in New Zealand. And the book has 14 chapters. There are 12 chapters devoted, one chapter each, for each radio station in New Zealand. So Arrow FM has got its own chapter, and we've been working with you on that, as you know. And then there is a big chapter at the beginning of the book, the largest chapter, which is a sort of a general overview and a bit of critical analysis and development stuff, which historically will be of use, I hope. The chapters about the stations themselves are what I would call good news chapters. It tells the story of each access station, whereas the first chapter does a little bit more sort of academic work, looking at it evaluatively and a bit of critical analysis. And then the final chapter looks a little bit at what we've just been talking about, the future of access and the development of Karma and the ways in which access is diversifying into other media. And you ask how it's going. Well, the situation at the moment is that virtually all the chapters have had their first drafts completed, and I'm in the midst of completing the first chapter. So hopefully we'll be submitting a draft for editorship within the next probably 8 to 10 weeks.
Excellent. That last chapter in particular must be very difficult to write, because every day, as we move into the future, more stuff happens. Things are changing at every station. It must be hard for you to finally say, enough now. This is the picture as it exists right now, and here are my not so much predictions for the future, because I don't think you're a soothsayer. I think you're a an intelligent and well-informed person, highly qualified to predict our future. But there must be hard to finally say that's it now.
Yes, every time I see Brent Impey on television, who, as you probably know, is currently the chair of New Zealand Rugby, I recall that prediction is not a necessary science or something that you can even do very well. Because it would be 15 years ago, maybe, at least 15 years ago, that I predicted in front of him that New Zealand radio would be digital within 10 years.
Right.
Well, you look around now, and of course, probably New Zealand radio won't go digital in the next 10 years. So prediction is a very difficult thing. And the final chapter will not predict so much as offer a range of scenarios that may or may not be possible.
I see. Wise. Brian, I've really enjoyed talking with you. I'm just, it's been interesting, hasn't it? Just on the personal level, you've talked about enjoying input from television, radio, books, etc. We're also, in a strange way, despite our isolation, I feel almost more connected to my community because as I walk around the streets, it becomes important to reach out to the people that I see passing by. My feeling of neighbourhood has extended to quite a large perimeter around my house. How are you? Is that your perception, or are you just stuck in your house reading your own stuff and keeping away from people?
Well, there are two things in response to that. The first is we go for a walk every morning, and it's depending on the weather and conditions. It's a 4 or 5K walk. And so we have noticed the increase in the number of people who are walking the streets of our suburb. And yes, we do say hello and we do wave. And sometimes we may even pause briefly to sort of say something, probably relatively flippant about the lockdown, but it is engaging with a wider group of people that perhaps we would have done prior to the lockdown. Because prior to the lockdown, we would have walked a little earlier and not so many people out on the road, more people probably going to the gym. So, there is that sense of community engagement despite the lockdown. The other thing is the technology. I think that many people in New Zealand have discovered Zoom and the other technologies, the other platforms that enable people to get together. And I've lost count of the number of Zoom conversations that I've had, and like as the Wire Rapper people probably would like to know this, that the U3A in Wellington is giving its lectures on Zoom. 500 people get together online to listen to a lecture. I am able to communicate with colleagues and friends all around the world, and we've had more Zoom meetings and contacts via the web than I've had probably in the rest of my life. It's just sort of boomed, if you like. Yeah.
And that's led to
those
efficiencies
two things are very noticeable.
Yeah, I was talking to
indeed.
Kieran McAnulty, our MP, Labour MP for the region, and he was talking about having to conduct all of his meetings via such technology, and he's felt that they've learnt a lot about efficiencies, apart from the fact he's not driving over Reumatakas, using up petrol and polluting the atmosphere. There's been just greater efficiencies within the meetings themselves. So we've learned some things.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because I had to have a GP consultation on the web.
Really?
I needed to get something checked, and I mean, I guess you don't need to know the details, but it was very fascinating.
Well,
because
careful, you could get into trouble for that kind of web content.
Yes, yes, but it was amazing how the technology could do the job. The fact that I had a camera meant that he could look at the little dot on my shoulder and make a decision about it, and I didn't have to leave home.
Yeah, fabulous. Yeah, and before too long, he'll be able to perform surgery on you in your own home.
Yeah. If we survive.
Well, Brian, it's been, not only do we have kind of domestic equipment to help us with our isolation, but I feel very privileged that I have a whole radio station. And although our broadcasters, our program makers have not been coming in, I've enjoyed keeping connected to our community and helping our program makers through the conduit of me sitting here at the microphone, getting their messages across consistently during this time. So what a fabulous thing Access Radio has been for that.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
And, you know, we can go for years without saying hello, Brian, and now because we've got the technology, there you are, and it's been a pleasure talking with you.
And it's great to see you, and keep up the good work at the station. It's very important.
Great. I look forward to the book too.
Thank you. All the best.
Bye, Brian. So that was Brian Pauling, who, as I've said, has often been described as the godfather of Access Radio, and his guidance throughout the years has been very valuable. We think we understand how an access station should work, and largely we do, but having a bit of advice from Brian from time to time has really helped keep us on track, but also aware of new possibilities. He's a person very aware of new technologies, digital technologies, etc., and we've been grateful to have learned from him over the years. That's it from me. I'll be talking to, this will be our first overseas connection. I'll be talking to Oscar Wilson in Los Angeles about his experiences of what might be loosely termed lockdown in LA. So until then, see you around.